Polzin, and I'm with Northwestern Division. I'll be supporting Nicole Burman with this webinar today, and would ask if you have any questions, please enter those in the chat, and I'll be monitoring those as we go through this webinar, and we'll try to answer your questions as we go. And I'd like to introduce our instructor today, Nicole Burman. She joined the Army Corps of Engineers in the summer of 2009 as an interior designer for the Kansas City District Design Branch. She eventually received her LEED certification and became a registered interior designer. She has primarily worked on military design projects within the region, including several mega and international projects. Her current role is serving as the Design Branch Technical Service Section Chief, where she supports the district with AE acquisitions and the Value Engineering Program. For many years, she's utilized her LEED training as the district's sustainability manager, where she helped facilitate high performance and sustainable buildings, leading many projects to LEED Silver and Gold certifications. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelly. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm glad that you're able to make it with us here today. Today, as Kelly said, we're doing the documentation coverage for our webinar series. And our objective here really is to identify and discuss those sustainability design documentation, the processes, requirements that are applicable to our DoD projects. So we have, as we have had on past slides, a resource page. So hopefully this is a really great tool for everybody. On this one, I have added those links to information for that third-party certification. And of course, we also have a recent ECB that we've attached to some of our resources, and this one would be very applicable for the documentation one. So looking at that ECB 2021-12, achieving the certification under LEED version 4. So we'll actually walk into that a little bit later as we go through the process today. We're discussing the high performance sustainable building requirements. That's including total building commissioning and that process, third-party certification, and some documentation elements with that, and then touching on that exemption, justification, waiver information. All right, so diving right in here, most of us are aware or have experience with UFC 1-202. So that's identified as that high performance and sustainable building requirement UFC. And this really, we're called to meet both that UFC and any service policies. So as we've gone through this series, you've noticed that sometimes there might be some small variances, and so we have to keep that in mind, or maybe one that has you, like Army policy, has you going a step further than the UFC. But our starting point here is really that UFC, and we're looking to document how are we meeting that UFC. So that's why we're here today. Really, we're wanting to make sure that that compliance is shown. The only way really to see that and to show that is really that PDP, so that project delivery team, those designers, documenting all of the hard work. We put a lot of work into our projects. We work diligently to meet all of these expectations, and so we don't want that to go to waste, right? Not that we would be wasting that. It's providing a solid building, but others, are wanting to see, did we meet that mark? And so let's show how diligent we are and how we are good at providing those high performance buildings. In doing that, we'd be doing that explanation, that justification into that design analysis. So we're looking for how are you achieving it? Why aren't you achieving it, right? If you're not able to, Is there a mission requirement? Is there a standard somewhere? Wanting to really dive into that information, and that should be placed there into that DA document. Then we also have the tracking items here. In the UFC, there's a level in which you start tracking that requirement, even though some services may ask that regardless of size of building, just to see where it lands to the best of your project requirements bring you to. But you want to look for, and that's and we'll touch on where that's located, but look for that service tracker and identify what is required in that tracking for each service that you may be touching, Army, Air Force, and so forth. And then within that, we also have that third-party certification element. So here we'll see today several elements of LEED, which is required for the Army, and then we'll touch on a little bit of the guiding principles requirement itself and kind of what that track looks like. So for the record cards, you want to either click that link that's in the UFC, or you'll go to the whole building design guide looking for that requirement tracking reporting page. And this is where you'll see here on the slide, we've got the service-specific ones. USACE has theirs for the Army, Air Force and NAVFAC has their information. And so go ahead and grab the latest and greatest from that website there. And we want to make sure that we're providing that detail that everybody is looking for. And here on this next slide here, we've got really what is that reporting requirement. So the reporting starts with that project delivery team. You're wanting to make sure that team is completing the HVSB checklist, scorecard, whatever it's referred to as. And really the best practice, I would say, is making sure that your district sustainability POC has this information, right? So they're going to have to identify and potentially talk to these projects. And so we want to make sure that that individual knows how the process is going. The first glance of really seeing something that maybe could be an issue, we want to bring that up, or if we're not meeting a certain piece. And then there's the physical reporting that's being requested by each service. So the UFC breaks this out, but we're looking at that project manager, ensuring that that information has been submitted right to the services. So at a minimum, we want to make sure that our MSCs are aware, but with the Air Force, they specifically identify when. So you're submitting at every single design submittal. So we'd be looking for that. And then that checklist and the DA would be submitted to that specific email that we've got up here on the screen and in the UFC. And then Army would be the MSCs, and then Navy is looking for that final design submittal, and then again at that construction submittal. So wanting to see all of those HVSB items completed all the way through construction, because there are some elements there that affect construction. Now, each division may have their own identification of what they want to look for and see to accomplish these. So, of course, always reach out to your POCs to confirm that there's not just this step, if there are any others. We have a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, a question about a list of MSC sustainability POCs. I think I will have that on our webinar on December 1st. That will be part of that webinar, and we will record that. But I think Eric Mucklow will be on later. I think we should be able to send that out to everybody and post it on Teams. See another question about documentation for DoD projects that are not the real property or funded by any specific branch or service?
Yes, so that can get a little sticky, depending on who you're working for and with. Where when we're working and they're employing USACE, at least our district, you know, if they're employing USACE to perform the project and the construction of it, then we're following that UFC unless there's some specific requirement or I don't know, I think maybe the DBA has their own like process and so forth. And so that's definitely a discussion that needs to be had and how far we go with that. And so that documentation, I would suggest to maintain consistency. Of course, if you're asking an AE to do it, then you're going to want to put potentially more information in their scope of work, right? Because you're not able to fall back on maybe as strongly depending on what your scope says or what that requirement is. But so definitely warrants some thought, some discussion, and confirmation that everybody's on the same page in how we're approaching these requirements. Kelli, have you had this experience on other projects?
Yeah, and I if there's more context as far as your situation, and we could talk about that separately, I think, if you are running into this a lot. But a lot of like the HPSB requirements, the 1-200-02, I mean, that's all rooted in federal, federal guiding principles. So as long as we're still talking federal property, most of this should be applicable to your projects. But I think there could be some interpretation as far as like the third-party certification and who's going to be responsible for reporting out on the tracking that Nicole was covering on the previous slide.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, I agree with that, Kelli.
So here's another question. We need DoD to implement guidance for their projects. So at the DoD level, there is OSD policy. I think it dates back to 2013 timeframe that refers everyone to the UFC 1-200-02 for requirements. So hopefully that answers it, where then from there service specific requirements kind of get layered in there. As we've covered on previous webinars along with this one. So hopefully that helps. This all kind of goes back to like the OSD level policy, and then there's service specific policies, but at the highest level, we're following UFC 1-200-02.
Absolutely. Okay. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide here. So to pull that information in and working towards that documentation piece, we're really looking at that specification level, at those drawings, reinforcing the sustainability goals of the project, all of that. So here we have during, at the beginning of a project, we're looking at designing and reinforcing all of that information into that specification. Now, some people can approach this a little differently here and there, but our specs have had updates to them to try to make everything more consistent and apply those sustainability, principles into that information, or at least provide, that spot to fill in the blank. If there's a certain percentage that you're looking for, recycled content and so forth, then that information is there for you. So mainly with the specifications, we want to make sure that we're reinforcing that project goal that we're establishing hopefully very early. We're making sure that we have that supporting documentation that we need and communicating that design intent. wanting to make sure that our specs are clear. So especially like the sustainability reporting spec, and then we'll talk in a second about the commissioning spec. Those O1 specs, we really want to make sure are clearly communicating those contractor responsibility. And so always keeping in mind what that voice is of that product. You know, we want to make sure that we're understanding that we're talking into construction requirements for that contractor, and not just like all of the requirements, right, that we all have to fill as a government entity too. So we want to be specific in here, and as I said there, so half of the content really is already in there, but then you have that other half that maybe you need to meet those goals. You want to be a little bit more specific in your specifications. Okay. So we're going to kind of, this ties into that specification element. So those help meet our project goals. And one of those for the high performance sustainable buildings is that total building commissioning spec. So commissioning is important. We have examples from a Texas Tech study that shows that up to 20% of the building's energy may be lost by just poorly operating systems, right? And that's on average for commercial buildings. So commissioning really aims to address that deficiency. Here we also want to, as it's kind of bolded there, right, not enhance commissioning. So we want to distinguish between what building or total building commissioning is versus what maybe we had referred to it as enhanced commissioning. The term enhanced commissioning is specifically for that LEED credit that we have there. And so it's almost like that square in the rectangle, but a rectangle can't fit in the square scenario. We've got where a enhanced commissioning most likely is covering and can be employed as that total building commissioning element. But total building commissioning as written for our requirements, and if you're following that Army information there, then it actually may not fully meet that enhanced commissioning credit. So again, this is something that needs to be discussed early in the project, confirming what thresholds you're meeting, confirming what the goals are of the project, looking at what systems need to be identified. So we have questions, right? You want to be asking questions of your stakeholders or your owners of projects, looking for, is this like, how far does this go? Looking for answering those questions of the ASHRAE requirements that commissioning brings up, confirming if we're going to be doing it to a point that we need a third party, right? So depending on the size of your project, you may need to hire an AE, and that takes some time. So working early on to work that in there and making sure that we have that information or get them on board in time to review. And then are we going after that enhanced commissioning credit? So that would then require, most likely require that third party individual, somebody that's not on the project team, to apply for that enhanced commissioning credit thatself. And so we have a lot of questions that need to be answered early on to really know what path are we going on, right, for the commissioning process. So the specification, though, in answering those questions, seeking out those goals, that specification then really flies into writing itself in some ways or continuing that discussion. So the commissioning, total building commissioning spec is the 01-9100.15 or 20, or 0.1510 or 20 if you're doing NAFAC. But that one specifically, you want to identify all those systems that are in there and looking at what makes sense for the scope of your project and the size of your project. and what your customer is looking for. And then you also want to dive into identifying those roles. So I always encourage people to look at the ER that we have. It defines a lot of these different roles and mirrors up with the specification in a lot of ways. And we want to make sure that that specification defines all those roles that we're identifying, how the government's involved or who are they, if the AE is involved, the contractors, commissioning person, the role throughout the project from beginning to end, depending on if it's design build and or design bid build. So one of those I've even noted here, there's a roles and responsibility matrix that can also help in this discussion. And I'll show you an example of that on the next, well, actually two slides, I think, from here. And then wanting to make sure we identify those standards, right? What ashrays are we utilizing, maybe to what extent, depending on the size of your project, and how they work together into that specification. Then there's that supporting documentation, which we'll go in and review in this next slide, but really touching on that owner's project requirements, that basis of design, and then potentially that design commissioning plan.
So we did have a question, if you could talk about this. So information on technical guidance for documentation, it sounds like there's a lot of reliance on the third-party certification for guidance on what documents are needed to meet each of the components of the UFC. Is there any other source to be looking at for actual documents needed besides some of those checklists or the design analysis? So thoughts on that?
Yes. So what I typically tell my teams, and especially too when it's a project that maybe doesn't require a third-party certification, right? We're looking to still validate somehow what how we're meeting that information. And so I think there is some learning from third-party certification that we gain in doing that, that then helps us know what products we should also have in the instance that we're only demonstrating that on our own with our DA. Typically, I like to have my teams talk specifically about how I think my DA has questions to them, right, to try to facilitate what information should have in there in our sustainability DA. I don't know what other districts may have, but that's how I've tried to tackle that, to where if there's a specific type of UFC requirement, I'm asking, is it achieved? Is it not achieved? To what level? Or, asking these questions to kind of help them facilitate the sentences that make up that DA or a checklist in itself. But that was developed a little bit over time. I don't really know if there's any other specific one for the UFC. I do have a link to the in the reference guide to our current sustainability guide, but it's focused on lead a lot more still too, and Army requirements. Kelli, do you know what other references that you may have used for just UFC information?
I think looking through, like, for commissioning, we've got the ERs. So I think making sure that we're following our ERs, looking for having someone on the project looking through the UFC to make sure we've got the specifications we need to have in there. We're addressing these sections within our design analysis, and then a lot of the documentation does come up through the third-party certification, as far as providing those backup details in a neat kind of package to help illustrate how we're in compliance with those pieces. So I think those are kind of like the go-to areas for us is, you know, making sure we're following some of those ERs and then working through the UFC and making sure we've got the specifications and then appropriate design analysis documentation in conjunction with the third-party certification path you're following.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point. Like I will say that the ER for commissioning, I think it takes a couple reads to really, as most things do, right? But to really dive into it. But once you get familiar with the information, it really speaks the process, in my opinion, fairly well once you get through the jargon of what those definitions or roles are. But I also will say that some of this is experience and maybe what people have been looking for in the past. And so we do have ECBs out there from lessons learned for sustainability from those headquarters and ASA auditing. So I will probably tell you, if you've gone through one yourself, you are now more attuned to what to write in or to track in your DA. And if you haven't, those lessons learned may be a good starting point too, to ensure that you've got the information that you need, because sometimes the lesson is just we couldn't find the information even if it was done, right? And so that really helps show how we want to document all of our UFC achievements there. Another thing too is the specifications also have those estimatable pieces. So at least on that end for the construction side, that would be those definitions of what we're tracking too. Those would be the supporting documents that would be piled into all of this. Okay. So still on commissioning, we're looking at that reviewing design documentation. So a commissioning team should be established to review starting no later really than the 35%. We're looking for early involvement with a commissioning team that's looking with that hat on, right? Looking at that owner's project requirements, making sure that that baseline of information is there. And a lot of times we get questions about the owner's project requirements, and you know, there's a few ways to handle that, different approaches that people may have. I know that I found that over the years, teams, you know, have found it to be less burdensome if it's a document that's already, you know, required or accomplished through other processes that are already in place. So like Air Force PCRs and design charrettes, where the PDT is identifying those owner project requirements. So that's critical that we're making sure that that is being addressed in there. So looking or confirming in your documentation with the ASHRAE requirements that those owner project requirements are addressed. And same if you use your DA. So there is, it could be included in your DA potentially, right? As long as you're clearly delineating an owner's requirement compared to how you're addressing that requirement as a basis of design. And so that basis of the design, moving into that, we're looking at how is the designer responding to those owner's goals, expectation, requirements? Are we tracking these goals, and so forth? And so those are the two documentation pieces that would tie into this commissioning process. I will note that the 019100 spec for commissioning does have a template. So if you're looking in there, I can't speak to how helpful or how it's been updated lately. but it does have one for an OPR if you're looking for maybe a starting point there. That information is in there. The specification does have 3 appendices suggested or identified in that, and that includes the OPR, the BOD, and then that design phase commissioning plan if you're including it in there. So we have another comment here. Looking at the design team working closely with the independent third-party agent. Like construction contractor was going to contract for commissioning. They determined the specifications and individual items requiring commissioning and so forth. Okay. Yeah, so I think when we talk about on the first slide, we're talking about what are those goals, what are we trying to achieve with commissioning. That's where we want to make sure that we have that addressed early. You know, if we're going after a specific credit for a third party, we've got to know the rules of that credit. If we're meeting that ER, we've got to understand what threshold we're at and to what extent does that project require, you know, that third party commissioning agent. Is that independent of the contractor? Is that independent of the team? There's a lot of questions we have to consider in here, and I think that's absolutely a great tool that you mentioned here, John, working closely together. That's really what it is. In all my experiences with commissioning, when we say commissioning team, it really should be that, and there's a lot to learn. There's so much information. There's so much to cover with commissioning. And so really we want to learn from each other, and the industry actually really has, in my opinion, right, and what I've seen, a really great grasp on this. They've been doing it and flowing through this evolution to total building commissioning in a lot of ways and showing that. So really gathering that information, making that part of your templates, improving the specification in the ways that you need for your project, identifying systems that maybe aren't on the list but should be depending on your project scope. Those are all really good discussions to have and to include and to work with that project schedule. That's probably one of my pet peeves too. It used to be that it was just a red zone activity. Commissioning really is a full project, a lot of submittal reviews, a lot of testing requirements throughout if you're going to do it right, of course tailored to the size of your project. So we have another question here too. Do we consider the DA as the BOD or 2 separate documents? So that's what I was kind of touching on and wanting to do. So it's great if we want to iterate this stronger. I consider it the same document. Some districts may handle it differently, but we've had success in Kansas City that it's one document, and that's what we upload. That's what we call it. I do think that it's good to maybe define that somewhere, like in the sustainability, or not in the commissioning spec, saying, you know, the BOD essentially equals the DA. Yeah, so I think that we want to write things out when we're documenting stuff. That's the whole story here. We want to write out how we're approaching things. And in commissioning, that's really, really important too, is if it's an OPR, where's the OPR? Is the OPR equaling a design charrette report? Okay, great. Is the OPR equaling the RFP that's written? Because that's where all the information is in there. Well, we probably need to say that. So what's the BOD equaling? I think that's a good comment. Okay, so last slide on commissioning. We also need to think ahead, coordinate what those construction commissioning reviews will be looking like. One way to do that is to have another designator inside your submittal register. We've handled it so many different ways. It could just be that it's a discussion that happens after the contract is awarded and figured out with the field staff and the DOR and working together, and which one of those items are there. It could be defined in just the roles and responsibilities matrix within that commissioning plan. There's ways to tackle it. The most important thing is making sure we know that which submittals are going to go and be reviewed, and ensuring that it gets there, right? So that the commissioning team can do their part, QA can do their part, and so forth. And so I have examples here of that being in that submittal registry. I also have examples on the bottom here of a project's utilization of that roles and responsibilities matrix. So this started off similar to the one in the ER. And when we're talking about the commissioning ER, it's the 1110-345-723 total billing commissioning. And so in here, I have found that this roles and responsibilities matrix, one, can take a while to maybe hash out depending on what size of project you have and your customer's involvement and a lot of factors, people's understanding of total building commissioning and so forth. But it's a really good tool, discussion piece to work through who's leading something, who's responsible for something, are they participating, are they reviewing, you know, is it an option? All of these pieces, and who's all on this team, identifying that somebody has a role to play when it comes to commissioning, and identifying all of those tasks. There's actually a lot of tasks that could be applied in the commissioning process that we want to make sure that we cover and people are aware of. You know, just the commissioning lead shouldn't be the only one who knows what's going on in that process and through both design and into construction, and then of course that follow-on time frame in reviewing how the building's performing during O&M. So in that construction phase, we're looking at that pre-functional checklist performance or functional performance testing. And I actually am surprised I forgot to put on another one. So if your project is to a level that you'd be doing that integrated system testing, that's probably one that really pulls the whole package together. If you've got some specialty systems or just systems that need to be interacting together, that would be the testing that could be added to your project if you're trying to ensure that those really are speaking to each other and moving and interacting correctly. That piece that may not be something we capture specifically in a QA process, but that would be the whole kit and caboodle with that one. Okay, so moving out of commissioning, going into third-party certification. So here we are looking at that independent review and assessment, holding projects accountable and for both the design and construction. And so there was a research or a study that shows the value of third-party certification, looking at the military and projects that have been done and what those benefits are. And it identified the benefit of that providing operational cost savings, contributing to security, improving indoor air quality were identified in that. And it's also important, too, when we talk about validating, meeting that UFC requirements, the third party serves as that in several ways. And if we're not doing that with the third party, then we also would be needing to validate that somehow, right? Self-certifying that we meet that, and that could potentially cost even more sometimes than third party would with our labor costs. So it just depends on how big of a team is working that and what that cost would end up depending on the project. And so third-party certification, we've got a couple groupings. We've got GBI, and they are covering that Green Building Initiative group is covering that Green Globes, and then that Guiding Principle Compliance. And then we've got GBCI, so Green Business Certification, and they're the ones that we're talking about lead in a lot of these situations, and then also the same with that Guiding Principle. So here I'm going to show that Guiding Principles assessment, just a quick comparison. We did show this on another one of our webinars, so I'm not going to go into much detail here, but I wanted to touch on something that you know for sure applies to Air Force. And so we're validating the UFC. We have receive a point of contact for any questions and reviews. And then both of these here are really showing the difference, similarities and differences between GBCI and GBI's processes. So we initiate it in some way, we get that project you know, surveys or registration forms, and then we go into the reviews itself. So GBCI has that primarily, maybe I can point here, the design submittal and construction submittal and certification. And similar to how LEED works, so they kept it pretty consistent in that sense. And then GBI looks at all of those reviews and then looks at that review in the primary report and then validates that with that on-site assessment. And then the project would receive that on-site review and report, which then ultimately would result in that certification. And they have different certification levels and so forth. So, okay, so LEED certification for Army, per the Army policy, it's required. And so this is, like I mentioned earlier, we have a recent ECB that came out with some guidance. And these are kind of the points that are addressed in that guidance. So I would, you know, suggest that everybody go out there and look at this ECB. It has some really good information to get people started. It's talking about how you can help your teams to focus on what LEED credits would optimize for the project in general. So it's still a big picture, and shortly I'll show you a little bit into that big picture, what credits may be possible. It has the DoD approved credit waiver information. So, you know, for instance, the male versus female ratio, that would be one of those quote unquote waivers for LEED that you can apply to your projects. It talks about the LEED version 4.1 credits, substitutions that are available if pursued. And then it talks about that points process guide. It talks about that success checklist. So it has some questions that can apply, your teams can consider, and then the waiver process there. So when we're diving into LEED, we're looking at that, yeah, I would state that a split review really is a best practice. I don't know whatever all districts, you know, application of this is. I know that in Kansas City, we default to a split review process. So this really helps us. First, you register the project, and you can always, I will say, you can always start with a split review process. And if there's a situation that happens, whatever that may be, and it feels that it's better for the project to go to a combined review, you can always combine it later. Just a little switch right in there that any project manager within LEED, identified as a project manager, can do. So this split review allows the designers the ability to you know, work on their documentation, fix that documentation fairly early in construction, because if you're going after an approach that I feel like is everybody's goal, or at least our goal, is to have all documentation finished at or prior to BCOES timeframe, so that we can submit it as soon as we can. And this split review allows you to do that. You would submit for your preliminary review. You would have USGBC would review that, provide you a report, or ask for clarifications, both on the front end and the back end of that report, and then you would go and submit again. So in that middle, that preliminary review phase, if the designers find that there's something that they missed or they need to edit for the construction documents to meet our sustainability third-party goals, we have an opportunity to do that early in the construction phase, or even as an amendment potentially, if this stuff moves within that phasing and doesn't have to become a modification. So that's something to consider. Of course, that's best practice scenario. I don't know if we all hit that target every time, but that's the goal. So then essentially by early phases of construction, the designers could be done with all their projects. We've got confirmation of what design credits are completed, and the contractor can pursue the rest of their construction phase with confidence in how many points they still have to get to meet their contract requirement for LEED Silver. So there's a lot of good pieces that come out of a split review if you're able to pursue that. Okay, so LEED documentation in general, it's good to know that when we're looking at these forms, we've got form information that's linked to credits. So we're basically starting in LEED 2009. They started combining or making sure that all of the FTE counts, visitors, male and female ratios, et cetera, were the same on every credit, because that was an issue before. Everybody would accidentally input information differently. So that's what's happening in these forms that we currently have. They're linked. Also make sure when your teams are starting your projects, they're going in these forms, and it may not look like that much to fill out, but the form expands. So you want to get in early and start, clicking on some of your answers, because one answer may say we're going to go through path or option 2, and then it expands into what does it take to meet option 2? What does that documentation look like? And that will evolve over time, right, depending on which option you pick and so forth. So we want to make sure teams are not just looking at the initial form, but starting to fill it out so that they can see if there's additional information that they maybe haven't accounted for. And then we're really looking there, the LEED updates, their supporting documentation. So we, in this scenario, there used to be an individual, say, spreadsheet for material credits for each one. Now we've got worksheets, so it really should be helpful in that sense. We've got one work that covers multiple credits. So that is helpful and potentially a tool that can be used elsewhere when people look for how much recycled content they're looking for, and so forth in that instance. And then we have, uploading supporting documents and their expectations for their file format. So that's also identified in there. So that's kind of the generalization of that documentation piece when it comes to LEED, things that have been defined and are looked at, so you're able to understand what those expectations are. And then I'll just put a little plug in, just FYI, there are options in here for a licensed professional exemption in this newer version. So you can apply or identify your professional registration, PE, registered architect, registered landscape architect, interior designer, and so forth. Now, I will say that if you're ever applying, you apply for that and then you submit a credit on the basis of your license is essentially an option. It allows you maybe to not do so much documentation, but doesn't actually, but it also is on you to, answer those questions if they come up, or to validate that, or to be accountable to that credit. So from my knowledge, I don't know of anybody who really does that. And from the idea of looking at how we want documentation to show and demonstrate how we have achieved UFC, I guess I would not suggest that. I would suggest always having the information provided and uploaded and demonstrating how we meet all of those goals. Okay, so we're getting short on time. We're almost done for all the general documentation parts. And so we'll go over a couple comparisons for the categories and points here. Really, I want to make sure we're aware in version 4, if you aren't familiar with LEED, there are prerequisites. So every version has a number of prerequisites. They are required for both design and construction related credits, and have to be met to even be considered to get certified. So in this instance, as you see on the left of the slide, there's a total of 12 prerequisites. So you should at least be getting 12 points out of the 110. When you go down to the furthest left on the bottom there, it's showing that visualization of the points that we're looking at when we're looking for LEED certification. We are called to meet LEED Silver, so a minimum of 50 points. But that kind of brings me to what we've got on the right-hand side. So this is pulled out of that ECB, and it's a great tool and information that we have here, identify what aligns well with our UFC, identifying, and you can go look at what all these symbols mean, but looking at where we need oversight from the field, looking at our additional oversight from the field, looking at ways to swap that with other information, and it's broken here. This isn't the whole score sheet. I'm just kind of showing what that can look like and what you see there. But I want to call out here, when teams are starting with this UFC potentially, right, they're looking at these credits, and it's starting you at meeting LEED Silver at 50 points. But that also includes, it's assuming you can get 3 points for innovation, and it's assuming that you can get 2 points in regional priority. And that could be possible. But all of these things have to be vetted early in the project to confirm, are we going to meet it? Are some of these iffy, right? Are they definitely in the maybe zone? We got to work through it more. And we've got to validate, to the best of our ability, making those educated decisions, risk management approaches to are we going to meet this? And 50 really is that minimum threshold. I have never seen a project go through LEED without dropping at least 1 to 4 points, depending on how you've accurately applied your project to these credits. So at the bottom there, I indicate that really each project should be reaching for 54 plus points when you start, construction or working towards that overall. So it's important that we're not just trying to hit that 50 mark. I, as a sustainability manager, if that goes out on the street at 50, I would be concerned. So we want to have some backup points in our pockets to look for how we can help both ourselves and the contractor meet that goal. Okay, so we've got, and these slides will be out to everybody. The rest of the slides really go into key takeaways for different pieces and parts. And if you have any questions on that, please reach out to us or our teams or on the teams group for questions or applications or how others are doing it. These are not all of the credits, but really looking at making sure, like this one, looking at making sure you define things early, talk about that project boundary, confirming that FTEs, operation, time frames, and how you're approaching those ratios. So And so we have here a bunch of information, but I kind of want to jump to, not to just highlight waiver stuff, but I wanted to kind of jump to what we've seen at ECB about waivers because we're short on time, and if we can go back to the stuff, we can. So I'll just kind of scan through here. We're looking at that, all the site information, some information about the water efficiency, best practices, key things we want to include, potential opportunities for innovation of water, water reduction, and several of these are actually been mentioned in other ones of our webinars. So I'm sure we've actually seen a lot of these or can review those before. And so I'm going to go ahead and go down here. First, though, I will talk about the innovation design and regional priorities. When you're documenting or looking at how these apply, we want to make sure that you're coordinating, again, early. So many things are early, and looking to understand the rules. So you can only have 3 exemplary performance credits within that innovation design. So in innovation design credits, you have the option to have an innovation design credit itself or an exemplary performance. So you've gone over and beyond a threshold that's identified in some of the credits. But if you're going over and beyond, you can only get 3 total of those. So you can't get all 5, I believe, that's there. And then we're looking at making sure that there's a lead AP on those projects. In version 4, it has to be a lead AP to, if you're wanting to get that credit, somebody on this team, design or construction, has to be a lead AP to the type of lead certification you're getting. So if it's BD plus C, they have to have a lead BD plus C. So that's a change. Additionally, when you're confirming regional priorities, they're based off of that zip code. So make sure that your zip code is identified correctly before you officially register everything, because the registration will then lock it, and so you want to make sure that that's correct. And then that's limited to 4 regional priority credits there. Yes, so we do have a comment about boundaries, when we're defining boundaries, to confirm how other projects, or maybe if they're seeking lead certification, that they're not overlapping. Boundaries can definitely be a big discussion, and so we would want to make sure that, I think in this version they did kind of change how those are looked at with the overlapping in case, and especially if you're doing campus projects, you've got to talk about boundaries early on and fully understand how they get applied at a campus level versus building by building level, because the buildings are the things that get certified, not the campus. And so there's a lot of discussion that comes into that and needs a strategy early and working through that. Okay, so what we know about exemptions, waivers, first, we've got to indicate, and understand, are we looking at a UFC, what UFC element is not being met, right? So we want to make sure we work with others in our district, identify those things as early as possible, look to your district sustainability manager, and determine if it's that UFC principle or if it's that third-party certification that's not attainable. A lot of times we end up going straight to third party, we can't do this. But your project may be meeting the UFC or should be meeting the UFC, but maybe can't fully meet some of the elements of the third party. So we want to make sure that we understand what are we talking about here and what's not being obtainable for that project. The other one, again, what we've been talking about today, documentation. So document. We want to see those justifications, reasons that things aren't met. What was the cause of that? Is there something that's not under USACE control. What's going on here, right? We want to justify everything we can to understand it. Have somebody who's not knowing anything about a project, about your project, understand it. And in the waiver, it is identified that it should occur as well as it can before that 35%, right? So we are being expected to look, assess, understand, figure out those justifications if there's some concerns, and highlight that very early in the project to work through both that waiver process, if that's what you're having to pursue, or work through how can we meet that requirement, right? If we see some issues there. But as it's defined in that ECB, we've got two types, like I said, the UFC or code requirements. That's going and submitting to the Chief Engineering Construction Division, ultimately up to headquarters. And then the Army policy is looking for that achievement of LEED Silver. And so that actually goes through that installation, has a requirement to submit that waiver up their chain of command. But USACE does play a role, right? We have the information, the technical know. So working on an attachment memo with that technical analysis, it is indicated in reference that cost is not really a sufficient reason for a waiver. I've heard that myself from the individuals that would be looking at waivers. So it's important to identify what those other reasons may be, or to work through it a different way if that's not attainable, unless there's something that's more complicated right there when it's related to cost. So I guess any other questions that we have here, because we're just over time here, but the slides will be out there if you need it. But if we have any question or two to address before we jump off.
I'm not seeing any. Let's see. Are there any examples of waivers we can get? I think the LEED ECB addresses some of the what we call credit interpretation rulings for LEED. So there are some of those kind of documentation of agreement on Army and DoD projects that we can submit related to some of the specific LEED requirements. I think that's all I would add there. I don't know if you have anything else you'd say, Nicole, on that one.
No, my quick answer is no. There's no examples that
Okay.
I've seen. So.
Okay. Let's see. Is limited project scope to achieve the Sustainable Design Development Principles or LEED Silver a reason for a waiver?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, limited project scope, I think if maybe if we're talking like you're just doing select systems upgrades and you're not doing like a full-blown renovation, I mean, that would be one where.
That's the question
Yep.
I got. It was a renovation of some huge warehouse that didn't have much going on with it.
Well, so I always go back and walk through it with my team again and again. You go to the top of the UFC and it has applicability. And so you go through how is this project applicable then to this UFC?
It said I think it's applicable, but I don't think they'll
Sure.
get LEED Silver. So I told them to go through the checklist as best as they could and see what they
Yes.
can or can't do, and then call for help.
Yes. Yes.
Because I reviewed
the
waivers too.
The UFC, you are doing it to the best of that project, and there's actually a lot of wiggle room when you work through those checklists, that HVSB checklist of identifying what you can do. Because if you have a whole system you're not doing, then you can't you're not touching it, so there's no change, so therefore you've met it, right? If that makes sense. But yeah, when it gets to, if it's the size enough to be LEED silver, then it gets a little stickier, and you have to kind of go through that. And that's when you absolutely, Annette, you go to your sustainability manager and they start working through that with others.
And I've reviewed waivers. It's not going to help you guys to look at it. You understand the logic behind them.
So I did get another question sent to me related to if the Army Lead Implementation Guide, Appendix H, if that's still the best resource for waiver information. I know that's getting updated, and we don't have Eric on here, so I wasn't sure if Nicole was tracking.
I think, Annette, I think you probably agree with this or don't, I guess. I would say this ECB that we have connected to here has the most up-to-date information about waivers.
I agree, because Eric added it.
Yeah. So I would go to the ECB for achieving LEED version 4 for that information.
Perfect.
Can you talk about the resilient pilot credits? Do you know about those?
Can you talk about the resilient pilot credits, Annette?
I want everybody to try to get them, but a pilot credit is different than a real credit. So the pilot credits can only be earned in that section with innovation points. That was a trick thing I didn't understand for a long time. So in the ECB, the double green arrows are formal LEED v4 credits, 4.1 credits. But a pilot credit is not a formal 4.1 credit. It's
innovation.
Yeah, so
yes.
So we put those to look at them, but the pilot credits fit in down there too.
Yes, that's a good point. So all of this you can find on USGBC to help you dive into it, but a good point in that when you're looking and so it looks like you put that right there, that innovation pilot exemplary points. So this is where those would all sit, and you have 5 slots to fill. So if you can fill all 5, great. If you can fill all 5 with a couple that you think are stretches but you want to try, that's good too. I've done that many times. But again, you are limited to 3 for the exemplary, but you can do as many pilot or innovations as you want. Okay, so feel free if you have to dive off, but we've got one question up here though. Or I guess it was about the BOD, the DA. So we're looking at separate BOD, which was directed, given to you from the end user and the funder. So you're saying, Eric, that they actually told USACE how to do their documentation and how they did the life cycle cost analysis. Okay, so it sounds like you received direction from the end user and how they wanted to see information. So you had that kind of as a separate package. All of this information. So the BOD, so your DA is typically that separate package. I guess maybe I don't know what the question is there. So. Okay, so seeking waivers during an RTAB service is not advisable. So I think that's just a general statement to us all. I agree with that. I think that there's more, I guess I would say for whoever's still on here, everybody feels pretty similar. There's a little bit of a gap in there and information. You know, we all want, at least I do, you know, I want to know more about if there's a gray zone in there, or how can I tell the story well, right? I will say that from my experiences with audits and so forth, that's where that documentation comes into play. Just write it all out. It's hard to get our team sometimes all to do it in the same way, but it's really important to have it written. What was the thought process? How did you come to this? Was there a decision that was made at 65% that changed the approach, right? Was it made at RTA, right? There's a lot that can go into our projects, we all know, that get changed. But I think that's where the beauty of the DA comes into play, and the importance of documenting that. I've had projects that major changes got modified in construction, right? So that's already well out of my hands, that caused major issues with third party. So there's things that need to be documented. If that's a memo of record later, right? If it's in constructions and something goes wrong for third party to that extent, that's another way I would suggest. But of course, none of that is officially approved or identified of how to approach that. So there's always room to improve, lessons learned and approaches for that. So hopefully we can get that someday too. Okay, so I think we've calmed down here on the chat. Thank you for lasting a couple more minutes over. The information will be out on our team's list there. So if you're looking for these slides, really make sure you go out there into the file information. We'll have that there. Dive into it. Send emails if you want. Message in Teams if you want. Gather more information. A lot of it's just spending that time diving in, figuring out exactly what that documentation looks like, and coming up with standards and everything for those requirements for each district. So I appreciate everybody's participation, and I hope you have a wonderful day.